The train was late, and the station buzzed with an impatient crowd. Commuters shuffled their feet, checked their phones, and sighed into the chill evening air. Emma stood apart from them, her headphones in, a half-empty coffee cup cooling in her hand. Her week had been miserable, a string of unremarkable days punctuated by sleepless nights. Tonight felt no different, save for the nagging sense that something was about to change. When the train finally arrived, Emma pushed her way into the nearly packed carriage, finding an empty seat near the window. As the train lurched forward, her eyes drifted to the floor. There, half hidden beneath the seat across from her, was a small leather-bound book. Its cover was worn, its edges frayed, and the clasp holding it shut gleamed faintly under the fluorescent light. She glanced around. No one seemed to notice the book, or her. She reached down, her fingers brushing the cool leather. For a moment, she hesitated. It felt oddly personal, like intruding on someone else's life. But curiosity won, and she slipped it into her bag. Later that night, she sat cross-legged on her bed, the diary in front of her. The clasp came undone with a soft snap, revealing pages filled with neat, meticulous handwriting. The ink was dark and precise, the kind that demanded attention. The first entry was dated 3 months ago. Today, Emma made her usual order at the coffee shop: black coffee, 2 sugars, no cream. She smiled at the barista, though she didn't mean it. She never does. Emma froze. Her hand hovered over the page, her heart hammering in her chest. It had to be a coincidence. But her name? Her drink order? The hollow smile she gave strangers. It was too much. Too specific. She flipped ahead, scanning entry after entry. Every page chronicled her days with an eerie precision: the outfit she'd worn last Thursday, the mundane details of her commute, even the argument she'd had with her sister over the phone 2 weeks ago. No one could have known these things. Not unless they were following her. Her fingers trembled as she turned another page. The words stared back at her, mocking in their familiarity. She won't sleep tonight, though she'll try. The whispers in her head will keep her awake. Emma's throat tightened. She slammed the book shut and threw it across the room. It landed with a thud, the pages fluttering open like a wounded bird. For a long moment, she stared at it, her breathing shallow. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, shattering the silence. She snatched it up, grateful for the distraction. It was a text from her sister. "You okay? You seemed off earlier." Her stomach twisted. She hadn't told anyone she'd been feeling off. Not her sister. Not anyone. The book waited in the corner of the room, its pages open, daring her to come back. She didn't sleep that night. Morning came too soon. Pale sunlight filtered through the curtains, and Emma's head throbbed from a sleepless night. The diary still lay where she'd thrown it, its pages splayed open as if mocking her. She wanted to leave it there, to shove it into her bag and forget it existed. But the thought gnawed at her, tugging at her curiosity like an itch she couldn't scratch. She picked it up cautiously, as though it might bite. The page it had fallen open to bore today's date. She'll try to dismiss the diary as a prank, but she'll open it again. She always does. By evening, she'll wish she hadn't. Emma's breath caught. She flipped ahead to see more. The next entry chilled her. In the coffee shop, a man will watch her. He won't speak, but she'll feel his eyes on her. She'll think it's nothing at first, but she'll be wrong. Her stomach churned, but she forced herself to close the book and toss it into her bag. It was ridiculous, she told herself. A coincidence, maybe even a cruel joke. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that the diary wasn't done with her. That afternoon, Emma stopped by her usual coffee shop. She wasn't even thirsty, but routine, and dread, pushed her forward. She ordered her drink, the barista greeting her with the same strained smile as always. As she waited, her eyes wandered over the patrons. Most of them were glued to their phones or chatting quietly. But then she saw him. He sat at a corner table, his face partially obscured by the brim of a baseball cap. His hands rested on the table, empty save for a single mug. His eyes, however, were fixed on her. Her pulse quickened, and she looked away, pretending to check her phone. Don't be paranoid, she thought. The diary can't know the future. But when she glanced back, the man was still watching. His gaze wasn't hostile, but it wasn't friendly either. It was, assessing. The barista called her name, and Emma grabbed her drink, trying to appear calm as she made her way to the exit. The man didn't follow, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she hadn't seen the last of him. At home, the diary waited. Against her better judgment, she opened it to the next entry. The page seemed heavier somehow, the ink darker. Tonight, her phone will ring. It won't be a number she recognizes, but she'll answer anyway. She'll regret it. Emma's throat tightened. She threw the book onto her bed and stormed into the kitchen, trying to shake the tension coiling in her chest. She busied herself making dinner, the normalcy of chopping vegetables and boiling water grounding her. But then her phone rang. She froze, the knife slipping from her hand onto the counter. The screen glowed with an unknown number. For a long moment, she stared at it, her heart pounding in her ears. Her instincts screamed at her to let it go to voicemail. But the diary's words echoed in her mind. She'll answer anyway. Her hand shook as she swiped the screen and pressed the phone to her ear. Hello, she whispered. For a few seconds, there was nothing but static. Then, a voice, low and distorted. Stop reading. The line went dead. The phone slipped from Emma's hand, clattering onto the counter. Her breath came in shallow gasps, and she gripped the edge of the sink to steady herself. The voice on the other end of the call replayed in her mind, its cold finality crawling under her skin. Stop reading. Her eyes darted toward the bedroom where the diary lay, half open on her bed. The air in her apartment felt heavier, pressing down on her as if the walls themselves were closing in. For a fleeting moment, she thought about tossing the book into the trash, or better yet, setting it on fire. But something deep inside her whispered, you can't escape it now. Emma returned to the bedroom, her footsteps slow and deliberate. The diary's pages fluttered slightly, though the windows were shut. She swallowed hard and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at it like it was a venomous snake. Finally, she flipped to the next page. The ink seemed darker than before, the handwriting sharper, angrier. She won't listen. She'll keep reading. The man in the coffee shop isn't done with her, and neither am I. Tonight, she'll hear footsteps outside her door. She won't lock it in time. Emma's blood ran cold. She slammed the diary shut, her chest tight with panic. Footsteps outside her door. The idea sent a shiver down her spine. She glanced at the front door, its deadbolt securely fastened. For now. The room felt oppressive, the shadows in the corners stretching unnaturally. She shook her head, trying to dismiss the paranoia, and grabbed her laptop. Maybe the diary was a prank, part of some elaborate social experiment. She had to believe that. Typing in "leather diary train lost" into a search engine yielded nothing helpful. She scrolled through forums, news sites, even obscure corners of the internet, but there was no mention of anything like the diary. Frustrated, she opened her bag and examined the clasp. It had no markings, no name, no manufacturer's stamp. It was as though the diary had appeared out of nowhere, just like the man in the coffee shop. That night, Emma locked every door and window in her apartment. She double-checked the peephole, ensuring the hallway was empty. Still, the diary's words clung to her thoughts, she won't lock it in time. Time dragged, each tick of the clock amplifying her unease. The apartment grew unnervingly silent, the usual city noises muffled. It felt like the world beyond her walls had ceased to exist. At 11:43 p.m., she heard it. The sound of slow, deliberate footsteps echoed through the hallway outside her door. Emma's heart raced as she pressed herself against the wall, her hand trembling as it hovered near the deadbolt. The footsteps grew louder, closer, stopping just outside. She bit her lip, holding her breath, praying the sound would go away. But then came the faintest scrape, a fingernail, trailing along the doorframe. The diary's words screamed in her mind, "She won't lock it in time." The deadbolt. It wasn't locked. Emma lunged for the door just as the knob twisted. With a sharp click, she threw the bolt into place, the metal vibrating under her hand. A second later, the knob rattled violently, as though whoever was outside knew how close she'd come to leaving it open. "Emma," a voice whispered through the door. It was soft, familiar, yet wrong. It wasn't the distorted voice from the phone, nor the man from the coffee shop. It was her own voice, just slightly off, like a recording played at the wrong speed. Her knees buckled, and she slid to the floor, her back against the door. The rattling stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. Then came a single knock. "Stop reading," her voice repeated. The knock echoed once more, louder this time, before the footsteps retreated down the hall. Emma didn't sleep that night. By morning, her hands still shook as she poured coffee, her mind replaying every sound, every word. The diary waited on the table, its presence heavy and oppressive. She knew she should stop, that reading further would only drag her deeper into this nightmare. But she also knew one thing for certain, the diary wasn't just predicting her life. It was controlling it. Emma didn't leave her apartment all day. The thought of facing the outside world, or the man from the coffee shop, felt unbearable. She kept the deadbolt locked and shoved a chair under the doorknob for good measure. But no matter how secure she tried to make her apartment, she couldn't escape the diary. It sat on her kitchen table, radiating an oppressive energy. She had thrown it in her trash can twice that morning, but each time she'd found it back on the table, open to a new page. The ink seemed darker, the lines bolder, as though the diary were angry at her for ignoring it. Finally, after hours of pacing and debating, Emma gave in. She sat down, her fingers trembling as she flipped to the most recent entry. She will try to hide, but she cannot escape what is coming. Tonight, she'll hear her own voice calling her name from outside the window. She will look, even though she shouldn't. Her stomach clenched, bile rising in her throat. Her apartment was on the 4th floor, far above the street. How could anyone be outside her window? She slammed the diary shut again and shoved it into a drawer, as though that would stop the words from burrowing into her mind. The hours crawled by, each one heavier than the last. By evening, the tension in her apartment had become suffocating. Shadows danced strangely across the walls, and even the sound of her breathing felt too loud. She told herself she wouldn't look, no matter what she heard. She wouldn't give the diary the satisfaction. At 11:13 p.m., it started. A faint tapping on the window. Emma froze, her heart hammering in her chest. She tried to dismiss it as tree branches or a loose shutter, but her apartment had no trees nearby. And the tapping was too deliberate. Then came the voice. "Emma." It was soft at first, muffled by the glass, but unmistakable. It was her voice, calling her own name. "Emma, come look." She squeezed her eyes shut, pressing her hands to her ears, but the voice grew louder, more insistent. "Emma, please. I need you." Her chest heaved, panic clawing at her throat. Every fiber of her being screamed not to look, but something deeper, a pull she couldn't fight, urged her toward the window. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "It's not real. It's not real." The voice stopped. Silence filled the apartment, so heavy it made her ears ring. For a moment, she thought she'd resisted, that the diary's grip had loosened. But then. Thud. A violent bang against the glass. Emma's body moved before her mind could stop it. She turned her head, her gaze snapping to the window. What she saw stole the breath from her lungs. Her own face stared back at her from the other side of the glass. But it wasn't quite right. The eyes were too wide, the lips curled in a twisted grin. The thing raised a hand and pressed it to the glass, its skin pale and translucent. "Let me in," it said, its voice perfectly mirroring hers. Emma stumbled backward, tripping over the chair and landing hard on the floor. The thing didn't move, its grin widening as it watched her. "Let me in, Emma," it repeated, the words dragging like claws over her sanity. She scrambled to her feet, grabbed the nearest object, a lamp, and hurled it at the window. The glass didn't break. The thing didn't flinch. It just stared. "Stop reading," it hissed. Emma ran. She bolted into the bedroom, slamming the door behind her. Her pulse roared in her ears as she pressed her back against the door, clutching her knees to her chest. Hours passed, though she couldn't say how many. When she finally mustered the courage to leave the bedroom, the apartment was still. The window was empty, the glass intact. But the diary waited on the kitchen table, its pages turned to a new entry. With a sinking feeling, she walked toward it, her legs heavy as lead. She didn't want to read it, but she knew she would. Her hands shook as she picked it up and read the next words. "Tomorrow, she will learn the truth about the diary. But it will already be too late." Emma dropped the book, her knees buckling beneath her. Tears blurred her vision as the realization hit her. The diary wasn't just predicting her future. It was writing it. The next morning came, pale and gray, but the light did little to soothe the growing dread in Emma's chest. The diary sat on the table where she'd dropped it, its pages still open to the chilling words. Tomorrow, she will learn the truth about the diary. But it will already be too late. Her breath felt shallow, her body hollow. The words cycled through her mind like a dirge. What truth? Why too late? Desperation clawed at her thoughts. She needed answers. She needed to understand what the diary was and why it had latched onto her. Emma spent the day in a frantic search, poring over every article, forum, and book she could find about cursed objects and prophetic writings. But nothing she found explained her situation. Nothing hinted at how the diary could manipulate her life so completely. As the hours passed, she began to notice things shifting in her apartment. Shadows moved in places they shouldn't. The lights flickered intermittently, even though the bulbs were new. And the window, where her reflection had appeared the night before, remained stubbornly cold, frost creeping along the edges of the glass despite the mild weather outside. It wasn't until late afternoon that Emma found something, a thread buried deep in a forgotten forum. A user claimed to have encountered a similar diary decades ago, describing its uncanny ability to predict events and control actions. Her hands trembled as she scrolled down to the final comment. The user's warning was simple and bleak. The diary is a contract. Each page binds you tighter to its will. Once it finishes your story, it takes you. Emma's stomach dropped. She glanced at the diary, its pages now fluttering on their own as though something unseen was rifling through them. Her story was almost done. By nightfall, the apartment was stifling, oppressive. Emma sat on the edge of her bed, clutching her phone, debating whether to call someone, anyone. But who could help? Who would believe her? The diary had moved to her nightstand, though she didn't remember putting it there. The next entry waited, and against her better judgment, she reached for it, flipping the pages with trembling hands. At 11:59 p.m., she will open the door. Her heart sank. No. I won't, she thought, slamming the book shut. She locked the deadbolt again, shoved the chair back under the knob, and even stacked a few heavy books in front of the door for good measure. She wouldn't open it. She wouldn't. The hours crawled by. The closer it got to midnight, the heavier the air became. Emma sat in the center of her room, her back to the wall, gripping a pair of scissors in one hand like a lifeline. At 11:57 p.m., the knocking started. Soft at first, but steady. It came from the front door. "Emma," a voice called, muffled yet distinct. It was her own voice again, low and calm. "You need to open the door. It's time." She pressed her hands to her ears, shaking her head. "No," she whispered to herself. "No, I won't." The knocking grew louder, more urgent. "Emma, you can't fight it. You know that." Her breathing quickened as she glanced at the clock. 11:58 p.m. She squeezed her eyes shut, the scissors trembling in her hand. The voice turned mocking, filled with venom. "Open the door, Emma. Or I'll do it for you." She couldn't stop herself, her body moved as though pulled by invisible strings. She stood, her legs carrying her toward the door despite her screams to stop. "No," she cried, tears streaming down her face. "I won't." Her hand reached for the deadbolt. The clock struck 11:59 p.m. The door swung open. There was no one outside. Just the empty hallway, stretching endlessly in both directions. Then she saw it. A shadow in the shape of a woman, its form liquid and shifting, stepped forward. Its eyes gleamed, reflecting her own terrified face. "Your story is finished," the shadow whispered. "And now, you're mine." Before she could scream, it surged forward, enveloping her. The next morning, the diary sat on the train again, its cover pristine, its pages blank, waiting for the next reader to find it.